Chapter 4. Jamie Long had stimulated our imaginations, including Mrs. Bond's. "He's got his eye on somebody," she said, "and heaven knows it ain't me." My cousins and I had helped each other wash our hair, which we were now trying to comb dry in a sunny patch of Mrs. Bond's backyard. Twilight was hours away, but I was eager to look my best by then. "We don't know him all that well," Margaret said, "and he's old." "Somewhere in his 30s, I'd judge," Mrs. Bond said. "30s and 40s are the right age for a man to marry. He's exploring his chances, that's clear to me. May Rose, you should consider whether you want this to go farther or not, and if your uncle would find him suitable. If you don't care for him, or if you think your uncle would object, you best walk out with him no more. Of course, it could be our parlor visit last night was enough for him to decide he don't want to see you again. If you don't like him, you'll find plenty others interested. My cousin said some's already asked after you, men that's wanting a wife, that is." My comb struck a snag in my hair. All I'd heard was the possibility that Jamie might not want to see me again. Last night I'd said nothing but hello and goodbye. Mrs. Bond continued, laughing. "But you know that's a load of nonsense. Jamie Long is interested, surely you got eyes to see that." I hadn't said a thing about him, though since the barn social I'd thought of nothing else. I didn't need to consider. He was new and thrilling, and I felt I'd always known him. "It will come to nothing, for we'll soon be traveling north," I said, picking apart the knot in my hair. "But Mr. Long said he'd like to go north, didn't he?" "Or west," Margaret said. "Well, my dear, prepare yourself to give a yes or no," Mrs. Bond said. "He's a lovely gentleman, and we all like him. Don't we, girls?" We do, Mary Agnes and Leola said. Margaret said nothing. I pulled at another snag, too embarrassed to reply. I held fast to Mrs. Bond's beliefs, for what I knew of courting and the ways of men was limited to the whispers of schoolgirls. I wasn't ready to show my feelings, but I began to think Mrs. Bond was right. I cared nothing for those other men who danced with me at the social. Jamie Long had shown his interest. It was time I showed mine. He came again, that night and the next. Both nights I stepped forward and took his arm for our stroll to the lemonade stand, as though acknowledging my rightful place. "Only speak when spoken to," Aunt Sweet had cautioned, so I initiated no conversation. He did not seem to mind. He talked enough for both of us. Saturday night, he met us at the barn doors and immediately drew me to the dance floor where couples were lining up for the Virginia reel. When the reel ended, he seized my hand. "I want every dance with you." "You must dance with Mrs. Bond and my cousins," I said. I was taken away by Hector, and after that, by other partners. But Jamie claimed me, again and again. On our way home, Mrs. Bond wanted to know if he'd declared himself. "Nothing of the kind," I said, as though she'd said something foolish. For me that night, sleep was a long time coming. Uncle Bert arrived the next day. He'd laid over, waiting for a boat to carry him and the wagon and horses down the Ohio and up the Mississippi River to St. Louis. Hector showed him into the parlor and called us, then hurried away to see if Mrs. Bond had returned from her shopping. Uncle Bert seemed different, but maybe that was because we hadn't seen him for weeks. He did not embrace us, for that was not his way, but he smiled and peered closely, as though assuring himself that we were unchanged. I did not feel the same. No longer a girl, but a woman experienced in train travel, familiar with a few blocks of a big city. I danced and enjoyed the attentions of men, and I wanted to be with one of them forever. "You had no trouble then," he said, casting a critical eye at the dirty hallway. "Our room is nice and clean, and Mrs. Bond is a good cook," Margaret said. She'd worried about her father's journey, and now she seemed to be afraid he'd remove us immediately to another house. But of course, unless he changed his mind about our destination, we'd all leave soon. Mary Agnes stood eagerly beside his chair. "We danced," she said. "You what?" I had not planned to tell. "Mrs. Bond took us to a barn social," I said. "All the children were dancing." "You as well?" I nodded. "The boy who opened the door for you, he danced with all of us." We learned the Virginia reel." "All right," Uncle Bert said. He looked tired. I suppose there was no harm done. In our room after each barn social, Mary Agnes and Leola had giggled about the excitement of dancing, especially with the handsome Jamie Long. Wisely, they followed my example and did not mention his name or report that not only had I danced with many men, I danced with one man half the night. Mrs. Bond welcomed Uncle Bert with as much enthusiasm as she'd shown for us, and like us, he changed his low opinion of her establishment when she showed him our clean room, and after that, a small one for himself. With her prodding, he shared more than he'd told us about the rigors of his trip. Clearly, he was worn out. "I don't want these girls to walk all the way to Fargo," he said. "I've got one wagon, but it's loaded with tools and such, so I'll need another wagon and team of horses or mules. I'd be happy if you'd point me to an honest man who deals in things like that." She said she knew just the man. The next morning, he left the house to speak with another of her cousins, who, in addition to making wagons, supposedly knew everything about the best places to buy harnesses and wagon teams. We all wanted to go with him, but he chose Mary Agnes, saying we older girls should give a wash to his clothes and pack up our own goods because we might be starting our overland journey any day. Because we'd be traveling through territory where natives sometimes conducted raids, he wanted to join a caravan of wagons. Mrs. Bond said her cousin would know about them too. Margaret, Leola, and I weren't happy to be left with work, and I suppose we all looked gloomy, because Mrs. Bond said, "You girls is going to have a great adventure. I'd sure like to go someplace different." I didn't want to go someplace different unless it was with my sandy-haired dancer. As it happened, the next time I saw him was too soon, a few hours later in the downstairs hall. I'd been in the backyard with Margaret and Leola, rubbing my uncle's clothes on a washboard and soaking my sleeves and the front of my dress in the effort. The dress was an old one of Aunt Sweet's, so faded and frayed I'd thought about cutting it up for rags. Sweat had been running into my eyes, and my dangling hair half covered my face. I was coming into the hall from the kitchen on my way to the bathroom when Jamie came through the front door. He looked to be accompanying my uncle and cousin. "May Rose," Mary Agnes called. "Look who's here." Embarrassed, I rushed past them and hurried up to the bathroom. After that, there was nothing to do but hide in my room. I had 3 summer dresses, this thing I wore for chores, and the 2 drying on Mrs. Bond's clotheslines. No one came to fetch me. I suppose that meant my cousins were busy entertaining Jamie Long. I stripped off the wet dress and hung it in front of the open window, then sat on the bed in my shift, ready to cry, angry that I'd been seen like this. Then, curious about how Uncle Bert and Mary Agnes had found Jamie and why he'd come to the boarding house, I opened the door a few inches and tried to make out the conversation downstairs. Finally, I heard goodbyes and the closing of the front door. Next, I heard Margaret's voice, and in a few moments a flurry of steps on the stairs. I was pulling on the wet dress when my 3 cousins hurried into the room. Margaret and Leola were each carrying a basket of freshly dried laundry. "You were supposed to come back and help," Margaret said. "Where did you go?" I took her basket, dumped its contents on the bed, and nervously began smoothing and folding. I had cramps. I'm all right now. "Mr. Long was here," Mary Agnes said. "He came to see Pa about driving our wagon."